Hello, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. I'm Hannah Chismar, a member of Rock Spring Congregational United Church of Christ and co-chair of the church's Faith and Democracy team, along with Leslie Atkins, who you'll meet later in the panel. We also work under the leadership of Reverend Marvin Silver and the UCC Justice and Witness Action Network. On behalf of the church, I'd like to welcome you to this panel discussion. As we know from the daily news headlines and latest developments in Georgia just this past week, the right to vote continues to be an urgent issue. For necessary structural change to happen in policies and laws, the starting point is the ballot box. But if not everyone is able to vote, then the change may not happen in a truly representative way. Participating in the panel today are several nonpartisan organizations who work fiercely to protect the right to vote and participate in our country's democracy. After I introduce the panelists, they'll each speak about different challenges and obstacles. We'll try to keep to a tight schedule in order to save time for questions, and I'll chime in if we need to move to the next topic. After all the panelists speak, I'll review action steps, which will detail the things all of us can do to get involved in this issue. All of the resources and action steps covered will be sent to you later this week. We don't have a Q&A button, so please email your questions to Reverend Laura Martin throughout the panel. You'll see her address in the chat. We'll get to as many as we can at the end. We're recording this event for those who weren't able to join. And now I'll introduce our panelists. Jamie Abrams is co-chair of the Arlington branch of the NAACP's Political Action Committee. She is a professor of law at the University of Louisville Brandeis School of Law, where she teaches legislation, women in the law, family law, and tort law. O.J. Seaman Sr. is a Rosebud Sioux tribal member and co-executive director of Four Directions, a South Dakota organization advancing equality at the ballot box across Indian country. Lucy Beadnell works at the Arc of Northern Virginia, a nonprofit focused on human and civil rights for people with developmental disabilities. Lucy's work focuses on advocacy, including voting rights. Chris DeRosa is the leader of the Arlington Falls Church chapter of nonprofit Spread the Vote Project ID. She is also a volunteer and board member with the One Virginia 2021 Foundation and serves as the co-coordinator of the Redistricting Issues Committee of the League of Women Voters of Virginia. Julia Tanner is the advocacy coordinator for the League of Women Voters of Virginia. She also serves on the legislative committee of the Arlington Civic Federation and is a commissioner on Arlington's Commission on the Status of Women. Andrea Miller is on the board of directors and actively involved in the Center for Common Ground. She also has founding and active roles with the National Women's Political Caucus of Virginia, the Virginia Poor People's Campaign, and is a member of the Democracy and Governance Working Group of the Virginia Green New Deal. As an IT professional, Andrea is a digital and election strategist and has successfully advocated for legislation on both the federal and state level. Janet Boyd is an attorney and serves as Director of Voter Services for the League of Women Voters of Virginia. She's also a member of the U.S. League of Women Voters Lobby Corps. Let's begin with Jamie and the federal landscape.
Wonderful, thank you. Just gonna get my slides up. Can you see those okay? Okay, wonderful. Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming on a Sunday afternoon. I am, as Hannah mentioned, the co-chair of our Political Action Committee, and I want to extend a warm welcome to the president of the Arlington branch, NAACP, Julius J.D. Spain is with us as well, as is my co-chair, Megan Reeser. And on behalf of all of us here from the NAACP Arlington branch chapter, I want to invite you to consider joining. I am brand new to the NAACP myself. I attended the march in June and heard JD speak, and he issued a huge call to action to our Arlington community to join the fight for racial justice. And I have pictured here the ship that's stuck in the Suez Canal, and I use that right now as a sort of metaphor for where we are in racial justice. And it's going to take so much work and so much of individuals stepping up to join the cause.
Jamie, I'm so sorry to break in, but I
Yeah.
only see a black screen. Would
Oh,
you
you
mind
do?
resharing? Yeah.
Oh, of course. Yes. Let me try again. And if that doesn't work, I'll just move without them. Can you see now?
Unfortunately not.
Okay. Well, that's okay. I'll
You
go
want
ahead.
me to pull it up? I have it.
Sure, that's
Okay.
great. I won't wait. I'll keep going. But I
Okay.
had pictured, the huge cargo ship that you all are seeing on the Suez Canal. That is sort of a metaphor for where we are in racial justice. And it's going to take so much work and so much creativity. And we can't leave this to our elected officials to be part of the solution. We all need to engage. And so I extend first a warm invitation to join. So in my time together, I would like to offer two points that are opportunities, things that we should be vigilant about, and 2 points of things that we should be excited about. So if you can go ahead to my third slide there. And the next one. Perfect. Thanks, Hannah. I really appreciate it. You can just throw all that text up there and we'll work through it all together. So just a quick background. So the 2 things we should be vigilant about is the status of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the status of Help America Vote Act and its effect on the voter rolls generally. And then another speaker will focus on Kentucky more particularly. But just a very brief background in the Voting Rights Act. It was passed to really give life to the vision of the 15th Amendment, securing the right to vote in the Civil War amendments. Of course, that right was not fully actualized due to so many voter suppression efforts. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965, really born on that bridge in Selma, has 3 provisions that are worth just having a preliminary understanding of. Section 2, which applies to all states and is a basis to reactively sue if there's a voting rights violation, but it requires money and expense to proactively sue. And then sections 5 and 4, which work together to regulate states that were historically part of voter suppression issues, many of states in the South particularly. So it includes a formula to get states to keep states regulated, and that comes from section 4. And the states that fall under that formula then have to pre-clear their voting rights changes. And the reason that matters is because that's proactive. It happens automatically. And it's been reauthorized many times with significant bipartisan support. That's the first thing to be vigilant about. The next thing to be vigilant about is the Help America Vote Act on our next slide. So the Help America Vote Act was passed in 2002. Oh, sorry. Thanks, Hannah. Just one more piece of you can stay on the slide, but one more piece of our Voting Rights Act. In 2013, the US Supreme Court struck down the formula to qualify states, many states in the South, for those pre-clearance efforts, which effectively gutted the proactive or the preemptive pieces of the Voting Rights Act. Thank you. Under the Help America Vote Act, this is another thing to be vigilant about. After the 2002 election, we saw concerns about how our voting was administered voting processes were administered at the state level. And so the federal government put in place a Help America Vote Act, which required states to perform ongoing maintenance of the voter rolls. And we need to be super vigilant about how states implement this, because these kinds of maintenance efforts can result in purges like we've seen in Georgia that disproportionately affect voters of color and young voters. And we'll hear more about that from another speaker and its implications in Virginia. But that's 2 things to be vigilant about on the federal levels. One more slide. Hannah, thank you so much. 2 things to be excited about on the federal scene. HR 1, this week, it's particularly gotten a lot of attention following what happened in Georgia. And what happened in Georgia is because of Shelby County v. Holder. So if states in the South no longer have to pre-clear their voting changes, it's sort of open season to make these changes without any monitoring or vigilance at the federal level. And so HR 1, there's 2 bills here that I'm going to highlight. HR 1, I would describe as sort of nuts and bolts improvements to election processes. And so some of this is in response to some of the things we saw in 2020 to expand voter registration through things like online registration, same-day registration, automatic registration, and increasing access through things like early voting, vote by mail, things we saw be very successful in the 2020 election. It also limits under that Vote Act some of the purging, some of the systemic and targeted efforts to remove often voters of color and young voters from the voter registrations. One exciting piece about HR 1 is it would move to independent redistricting for congressional seats, which is something coming up after the 2020 census. And it would take steps to stop the proliferation of false information relating to voting. There many things have gone out with the wrong days, the wrong sites, and false messages to deter voting. So that was passed already in the House and was heard in committee this week in the Senate. And then finally, the last thing I'll highlight is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. This is also known as HR 4. And this does two things, and this is also pending at the federal level, and it is on my list of 2 things to be excited about. And this responds to what I was describing with Shelby County v. Holder, and it would return those Section 4 and 5 protections, but it would modernize the formula. So the court didn't strike down the law itself. It struck down a formula that was based in 1964 data. And so it seeks to modernize the formula to get states regulated, to get states monitored for if they have a history of voter suppression activities. And then second, it would take some of the things that we know are frequent offenders and that can disproportionately affect communities' voting access and make certain activities nationwide require pre-clearance. So for example, if a local precinct were to reduce polling locations in diverse communities, that would need to be pre-cleared. And so in our list of action items, I have included some ways to reach out to your elected officials in support of these efforts. But that is, in my part, 2 things to be vigilant about at the federal level: the Voting Rights Act and the Help America Vote Act, and 2 things to be excited about: HR 1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Now over to OJ Siemens.
There I am. How he honey wash day. Madaki we chose on basically what it says: hi, good morning, my relatives, and I pray for your health and help. Thank you for having me here. I think this is a very important thing that we have these types of discussions. Like it was said, I'm from the Rosewood Sioux Indian Reservation, but I work on reservations throughout the United States. Currently, being Georgia is on the topic, we're working with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under the law and getting tribes and tribal members as plaintiffs for the lawsuit that's going to be filed down there. Some have, there will be others filed. It's really a dangerous time when you can have legislative officials take the right to vote or try to stop the vote. You know what? That's one thing. The vote's supposed to be legal. You're supposed to be able to vote. And basically what they're trying to do is they're saying you can't vote. We're just going to make it very difficult for you to vote. But that's something we've been dealing with forever. You know, some of the things that we've been doing, and we do use the Voting Rights Act quite a bit, Section 2. And since a pre-clearance, they said, you know, that there's no more racial divide out there, and everybody's doing everything. We filed more lawsuits since they have gotten rid of Section 2, or excuse me, Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. What we have been doing and what I want to talk to you about, and it's something all kinds of people can do. First, you know, we talked a little bit about the Help America Vote Act funds. We've been pushing Congress to use some of that money, and you can, to establish satellite offices. In that way, the counties cannot complain, or the cities and municipalities cannot complain about them not being able to afford to have these satellite offices using federal money. We were able to do that in South Dakota. Of course, it took 2 lawsuits. And we were finally able to sit down with the election board and the Secretary of State. We put ourselves inside the Help America Vote Act committee, and we developed formulas in which we would be able to have tribes go ahead and apply for and get satellite offices for early voting in South Dakota, which is about 46 days. We've done the same in Montana. We started out with 3. We now have 13 in Montana. We also, again, we had to sue Montana. And we went to Nevada. We tried to work with them. It didn't work out. So we had to file a lawsuit in Nevada. Now Nevada has it so that any tribe can request a satellite office for early voting anytime during any election. So, I mean, we are making headways. We did the same thing in a lawsuit in Arizona and put satellite offices on the Navajo Indian Reservation. And the reason I'm telling you this is the fact that we filed under voter denial. Now, they argued over and over basically that we had a way to vote, so we should be good. And we said basically, no, you know, it has to be equal across the board. And so some of these places like what happened in Georgia, the lawsuits that we filed in South Dakota, North Dakota, even in Arizona and in Nevada are going to come in handy here, because the fact is that part of what they're doing by shortening the hours is actually a voter denial. So the groundwork we have been laying for like 8 years now or 10 years, I think is going to be used extensively in Georgia. If not, then I'll call them and tell them. You know, that's basically it in a nutshell. And I guess the last thing I would say is to look at your communities, especially communities of color, to see whether or not they have voting right or have access to early vote in person or by mail. One of the things that we also did is we took the non-Indians that were the poll workers and replaced them with natives. And so what I'm encourage you to do is look to see whether or not a satellite office would work in communities with people of color, and work to have those individuals sitting behind the desks as the poll workers. The voter suppression doesn't always start in a governor's office or with the legislatures. Voter suppression can be 3 feet away from you. That means the table that you walk up to vote can actually take and encourage you to vote or ask you to leave. So, I guess my time's up now. I want to thank everybody for allowing me a chance to speak, and it was really nice meeting you. Wopala.
Thanks so much, OJ. Over to you, Lucy.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about voting rights for people with disabilities. So at the ARC of Northern Virginia, a lot of our work is focused on people with developmental disabilities, but most of the voting rights laws are the same for people with all manner of disabilities. And a lot of those rights and protections come from the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And what's important to know about that is the ADA defines disability very broadly. So any condition that is going to impact essentially the way that you live your life and perform typical life functions. So it certainly is things like developmental disabilities like autism, physical disabilities like having to use a wheelchair, but it can be things like a cancer diagnosis if you're undergoing treatment or the cancer's progression is making it hard for you to engage in daily life activities, or diabetes or vision loss or a whole manner of disabilities. And that all comes into play in a big way when we talk about voting accessibility. So voting accessibility is totally protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the goal of the ADA in general is to make sure that people with any kind of disability have at least equal access to services and supports. And so it may look different than the way people without a disability access it, but they need to have the same ease of getting to it and the same ease of using it. So regardless of what Virginia is doing in terms of accessibility and accommodations for voting by mail, people with disabilities always have the option to vote by mail. They don't have to be working out of the area or working more than 8 hours, 9 hours during the day of the election or whatever. You just by virtue of having a disability, you are able to vote early and by mail. And remember, that definition of disability is very broad. Any in-person polling places have to have accessible curbside voting options. And so curbside voting is where you would pull up to the polling place And instead of going inside to vote, you would say, my disability makes it difficult or impossible for me to get inside. So certainly that can be if maybe you have fibromyalgia and you're having a day with a lot of pain and getting up and getting inside the building is not realistic. But we have folks who contact us because they have autism. And the sensory input from coming into a room with lots of people talking and chattering and standing in line and bright lights is too much for them. That's another reason that curbside voting may be an option. So if there's any reason that getting inside to vote is not a reasonable or accessible option to you because of a disability, then they can bring the polls out to the vehicle. So there should always be a sign posted with a number to call, say, hey, bring out the curbside voting materials. And they'll bring everything right to the car. They'll check IDs at the car. They'll have people vote at the car, and then they'll take the voting materials inside and you can drive away without ever having to leave the vehicle. There should always be signs showing that there's an accessible route into the building, including bathrooms. So you can't very well have an accessible polling place if everyone else is allowed to go to the bathroom except for people with disabilities, right? So it should be every part of the building and the voting experience is totally accommodated and accessible for people with all kinds of disabilities. Voting booths themselves need to be accessible. If you need help understanding or completing the ballot for motor skill reasons or cognitive reasons, you can ask for a poll worker to read you the ballot and fill it in for you. Or you can ask to bring someone with you who you trust to help you read the ballot and fill it in for you. Especially with things, like bond referendums or ballot initiatives that may be long or complicated to work through. We've got a lot of folks with developmental disabilities who just feel more comfortable having someone help talk through that. So those are the kinds of things that are always available. If you need a seat while you're waiting to vote, that should always be made available. There should be plenty of space for voters in wheelchairs who have to maneuver. If people need to communicate, not orally, but maybe in writing or on a communication device or typing something out in a note on their iPad to share about their needs or their questions, any of that should be accommodated. Any way you get there, any way you want to vote, any way you need to be communicating should be absolutely fine, including magnifiers for electronic materials. We always advise people in advance of voting to go to the State Department of Elections webpage on accessible voting. And it's great because it really does give a lot of examples, like I did, about the ways that you can vote and get accessible voting options. And people are always welcome to contact us at the ARC of Northern Virginia, and we are happy to talk people through things. Sometimes we get calls or emails the day of an election. Always it's helpful if you're actually in that moment experiencing a barrier to voting, take a picture or a video on your phone, especially if you go vote earlier in the day and you get that video or photo to me. By the end of the day, we should have it worked out so you can go right back and vote again, or you can vote another way. So we are in such a magical age that we have the ability in our pocket to record that kind of data. So absolutely take advantage of it. Everything from a voting site that has no curb cuts, so you can't get inside if you're using a wheelchair, to a poll worker who gives you information that's not correct. Anything that you feel like is a barrier to voting, even if you ultimately are able to vote, great for you for persisting. But please, those photos and videos are so important because we know that there are people who don't take those pictures, who don't ask. And we want to make sure that we're busting down the barriers for those folks too, who may not know their rights or may feel shy about advocating for them. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to our next speaker.
Chris, I can see the slides, but I can't hear you.
I forgot to unmute myself, sorry. Anyway, thank you, Hannah and Reverend Laura for putting this panel together, which I think is fabulous information for all of us. So I'm going to talk about restoration of rights. Don't know if you know that 5.2 million Americans cannot vote because of a felony conviction. Most of those people are people of color, which is not surprising to most of you. For example, 1 of every 16 African Americans have been estimated to have lost their voting rights due to felony disenfranchisement laws versus 1 in every 59 of non-Black voters. voters. Virginia is one of those states with the highest number of people who have been disenfranchised due to felony convictions. It's estimated that 6% of our voters, or 400,000 Virginians, cannot vote because of felony convictions. Our Constitution states that no person who has been convicted of a felony shall be qualified to vote unless his civil rights have been restored by the governor or other appropriate authority. So as you probably know, Governor McAuliffe was able to grant civil rights back to 173,000 returning citizens, despite the court's ruling that he had to do so on an individual case basis rather than by executive order. So this past special session of the General Assembly, they passed SJR, Senate Joint Resolution 272, which started as a universal right to vote bill, constitutional amendment actually, which would have allowed any citizen of Virginia residing here 18 years or older to vote no matter their circumstances, whether they were in prison or not. It was changed on the Senate floor to an automatic restoration of rights bill, so it now says that upon completion of your prison sentence, rights will automatically be restored. Because this is a constitutional amendment, it has to pass again in the General Assembly in 2022. Then it will go to you, the voters, in November of 2022. So the wording would be changed and to look something like this. No person who has been convicted of a felony shall be entitled to vote during any period of incarceration, but every such person upon release from incarceration and without further action shall be invested with all political rights, including the right to vote. So that will change how things are done. 2 weeks ago, Governor Northam announced that he will follow the guidelines in the proposed constitutional amendment, and he would restore voting and civil rights to 69,000 Virginians who have completed their prison terms. They will not need to wait to complete their probation or supervision or pay fines. That often added 5+ years to their waiting period. So we've already thanked the governor, and these are some of the people that we have helped to either check or request that their rights be restored on their behalf. I ask that you support the SJ 272 when it comes up again in 2022 on your ballot and in the General Assembly. If you'd like to join us in helping these people, you can write to me at arlington@spreadthevote.org. Thank you.
Now over to Julia.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you so much, Hannah. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with your members and guests about absentee voting today. When Virginians vote, our democracy is stronger. Voting absentee permits busy voters to go about their day without taking a great deal of time to vote. And it also reduces lines for other people at the polls, which is helpful at any time, especially during the current health crisis. Our Virginia General Assembly has great power to improve access to voting, and they have made great strides for absentee voters over the past year, starting with HB 207 from the 2020 general session. This bill eliminated the need to provide an excuse when you vote absentee in Virginia, and it provided for a 45-day period of no excuse in-person absentee voting. Both of these measures proved fortuitous when the COVID-19 pandemic struck, because people wanted to be able to vote without entering a polling place or standing in line with other people. The 45 days helped to space out how many people would be dropping off absentee ballots at any given time for the many Virginians who like to fill out an absentee ballot, but then themselves take it to the polls. Still, more could be done, and voting rights advocates researched how best to support a safe and smooth election in challenging circumstances. And believe me, legislators were asking for ideas. The League of Women Voters of Virginia mentored Harvard Law School's interns who wanted to help support voting during the pandemic. They conducted a 50-state survey of measures such as the use of drop boxes for absentee ballots, and other ways to provide for voting with less interpersonal contact, which is what was concerning people. We and others asked lawmakers to enact reforms to support voting. We requested in particular the drop box measures, allowing qualified absentee voters to drop off their ballots at the polls. And our legislators ensured that these were the first bills passed in the special session towards the end of last year in time to be implemented for last year's general election. Additional aspects of that special legislation provided that absentee voters would receive an opportunity to cure certain procedural errors on their absentee ballot envelopes, and the bills provided for postage for return of absentee ballots. The League, working with the ACLU, also sued to ensure that voters would not have to have a witness for their absentee ballots. This can be challenging for voters who live alone, many of whom have disabilities or lack transportation, and the witness requirement deters voting. This year, we asked legislators to make all of these measures permanent, and in time, this came largely to pass. HB 1888 and SB 1245 will let qualified voters drop their ballots at the polls and will ensure absentee voters get an opportunity to cure certain procedural errors again. These bills also provide for postage paid return envelopes. In addition, election officials are required to pre-process absentee ballots, which will help reduce election night surprises. And further, the budget bill will ensure that this law will be effective immediately. Assuming final adoption at a reconvened session in early April, these protections will be available in time for the May municipal and June primary elections. Unfortunately, a witness signature will still be required on absentee ballot envelopes, except during declared health emergencies like COVID, and a working group will develop processes for further addressing such concerns. As a separate matter, I think in connection with the points made by today's first speaker, it is good news on a state level that our Virginia General Assembly just passed a state Voting Rights Act. SB 1395 and HB 1890 provide that major election changes in Virginia, including things like moving a polling place far away from public transportation, will first need to be submitted to be pre-cleared by the Attorney General or by localities putting the new practice out for public comment. And the bills prohibit the state or any locality from imposing any voting qualification or process in a way that results in denial or abridgment of the right to vote of a citizen based on race, color, or membership in a language minority group. In Virginia, we've come a long way over the past year, and more can be done. We can discuss what remains and how you can help during the action steps later today. Thank you.
I am changing my hats. And I'd like to update you on what's going on with redistricting and ending gerrymandering in Virginia. As you know, we now have a bipartisan citizen-led redistricting commission, thanks to the vote of the overwhelming Virginia voters last November. So we have 16 members on the commission, 8 are delegates and 8 are citizens. 2 of the citizens, Greta Harris and Mackenzie Babichenko, were selected by the commissioners as their co-chairs. So they are responsible for drawing up the maps, and supermajorities are going to be required to approve the maps, which are then sent to the General Assembly. The General Assembly will vote up or down on the maps. If there are 2 attempts that will be allowed, if those 2 attempts fail, then the Supreme Court of Virginia will appoint 2 special masters or experts to draw the maps. Note that the governor does not have a role or the power to veto here. So there are many criteria that were included in the constitutional amendment or in supporting bills. One of the biggest ones, in my opinion, is transparency. All records and meetings of the commission shall be open to the public, and the commission will hold at least 3 public hearings in different parts of the Commonwealth. The maps have to provide fair opportunities for racial and ethnic communities and language minorities to elect candidates of their choice. The maps must preserve communities of interest, They have to be compact and contiguous, and they shall not unduly favor or disfavor any political party. There's also a section that addresses prison gerrymandering. So now Virginia residents who are incarcerated in prisons that are located often in rural areas will be assigned as constituents in their last home address area. Non-residents, out-of-state residents, those without known addresses will be assigned to the location where the prison is found. So the House and Senate maps are due 45 days after the receipt of the 2020 census data. The congressional maps will be due 15 days after that. So the question is, when will the census data be provided? And the best answer I can give you is, who knows? But we do know a little bit. We think that by April 30th, the apportionment data will be released. Usually it's released at the end of December. So this is 4 months later. This will tell the states how many congressional seats that they will have for the next 10 years. A few states will gain seats, a few will lose. Virginia is expected to keep its 11 congressional seats. Then the real data, the census data, will be delivered September 30th. Usually it's about this time of the year. It's possible we'll get the data in August, but it will be, they said, in an old format, which is less user-friendly. So it may not be till September 30th. So obviously, we could not hold our House of Delegates elections using any new maps because they will not be available. So the old maps are being used for the primary election on June 8th and the general election on November 2nd. It is possible that there will be another election in 2022 using the new maps, but at this point, we have no idea what's going to happen. So actions that you can take, there is a meeting coming up of the commission on March 30th. That's Tuesday morning, starting at 10. And then they have also announced 3 more meetings after that, all Tuesday mornings, starting at 10. Remember, these meetings are open to the public. You can sign up to speak if you wish. Go to the website, redistricting.dls.virginia.gov. You may also send in written questions or comments using this email address. Please note that if you do submit an email to them, it will be published on the website. So do not include your phone number or your home address unless you want those known to the public. So please attend the meeting. Also, please save the date, April 29th. That's a Thursday, 7 p.m. The League of Women Voters of Virginia will offer a Zoom event. We will have Redistricting 101, providing a background information. And we'll also talk a lot about communities of interest and how you can get involved and drawing your own map for that to submit to the commission. Join our outreach circle. The League of Women Voters is using this to generate short emails to update you on redistricting and other pertinent issues such as voting. And if you would like to contact me by email, chris.lwv.222@gmail.com. Thank you very much.
I'm next. I'm Andrea Miller, Center for Common Ground. And one of the things that we do is we work both federally and then also in Virginia, always looking very carefully at 2 things. Number one, what is going on with polling places, because we do work very hard in getting out the vote. And a huge part of getting out the vote is making sure people know where the voting is. And the other thing that we work on is we work on re-registering voters who have been removed from the voter rolls. So I'm going to look at what we need to do in Virginia and then also why the federal legislation for the PEOPLE Act is really going to be so very, very important. So number one, when we think about voting, and I always think of all the voter suppression states. Many are in the South, many are in the West. Virginia is no longer in that class of a voter suppression state because while so many other states work to suppress the vote, this year, Virginia did an extraordinary job in expanding the vote. So the For the People Act sets a minimum baseline of what elections have to look like in all 50 states. And I really hope that all of our voting rights activists here in Virginia, we do not want to become so spoiled with all the great things that we have in Virginia that we forget about folks in the other states. For instance, one of the things the For the People Act does is it establishes that all states will provide drop boxes. And also, every county will provide drop boxes based on every 20,000 people is what they must do. So I don't know if you remember in Texas, the governor of Texas said, I'm going to permit one drop box per county. Well, Harris County has 1.5 million residents and they had one drop box. So this new law would enshrine, we are really working toward making voting a right rather than a privilege. Also, the For the People Act contains the Democracy Restoration Act, something that I was privileged to work on with Congressman John Conyers. So, in other words, once people are released from incarceration, if they have a felony conviction, in their exit package would be a voter registration form. Because many people falsely and incorrectly believe that once they have a felony conviction, they will never be able to vote again. And that just simply isn't true. It is amazing how bad misinformation so easily and quickly spreads. One of the really important things that we are really going to need to do for all of us who register voters is that we tell voters the truth about their voter registration. When you register to vote, because voting in the United States is still a privilege, it is not a right, you can and will be removed from the rolls for not voting. Most people have no idea that that is really a thing. And in the 43 states that are really pushing on the voter suppression, one of the things they want to do is if you miss voting in 2 federal elections, that's 4 years, then you will be deregistered. And in America, only registered voters are going to be allowed to cast a ballot. And most states do not offer same-day registration. So when we register voters, it is very important that we remind voters, it is very important that they vote. Now, again, Virginia is very, very expansive in how they maintain their voter rolls. In Virginia, you need to miss 4 federal elections before they will move you off the rolls. So normally in Virginia, we have about 268,000 community of color voters who have been file maintenance off the rolls. That's normally where we sit. Since 2020 was the presidential year, and we used if you miss 2 presidential elections, Virginia is now sitting at 468,000 deregistered community of color voters. So that means if we look at on a national level, that number normally is hovering around 16.8 million. If these new voter suppression laws pass and are allowed to be enacted, then we could be seeing more than 20 to 25 million people being removed from the voter rolls for not voting. So the second thing we really want to stress to voters is check your voter registration status at least 4 times a year. Make certain that your board of elections doesn't confuse you with a person who has died and they are legitimately trying to remove them off the rolls. You also want to make certain you do not get moved to inactive status because mistakenly a change of address has been attributed to you and you have not responded to a request by the Board of Elections to verify that you are still at that location. So as voters, we need to be very vigilant and we need to ensure our new voters understand this is what you're going to want to do, just as we insist people know the rules of the road. It's very important that people know the rules of voting. Oh, and one last thing. When we get out of COVID, I really would like to see our very large senior centers go back to being designated as polling places so our seniors aren't forced in winter to try to go somewhere and vote. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. This is Janet Boyd, and I am the last speaker, and I'm going to be talking about the new rules with regard to what IDs you need to have in order to vote. And when I'm talking about in order to vote, I'm talking about in-person voting. The rules for absentee voting are different. Julia gave you a lot of that information. So I'm going to focus primarily on what happens on the day of whether you vote early in person or you vote on the day of the election in person. And in this area, we're quite fortunate that the General Assembly last year, even before the COVID crisis, passed some very good rules with regard to the picture ID. In other words, prior to the changes made in 2020, all voters, whether you were voting early or voting on the day of the election, were required to show a photo ID. And if you didn't have a photo ID, you wouldn't be able to vote. There was quite a number of various types of photo IDs, but photo ID nevertheless was required. Since the November election of last year, no longer are photo IDs required, but there are ID requirements. So I just don't want you to think that you can just show up and not have to worry about the ID requirement. There are roughly 9 options now, and even those 9 options have been liberalized quite a bit. The most common ID that most voters will bring is their driver's license or perhaps their passport. Their driver's license now does not have to be, in other words, just to clarify, it could be expired. It used to be you'd only have 1 year of expiration. Now it could have been expired 4 or 5 years ago, and you can still use that as your photo ID. And if you don't have a driver's license but have a DMV ID, that works just as well. And as I mentioned, the other common one is passports. Those do have to be valid. In other words, they can't be expired. You probably received a confirmation card when you did register to vote. You can use that confirmation card. Another option is any ID card. It doesn't have to be photo ID, issued by the United States, Virginia, or a local Virginia government, not Maryland, for example, or DC, but as long as it's either US or Virginia ID, even if it doesn't have a photo, that's okay. It has to have your name on it. You can use any student ID card issued by a United States university. It doesn't have to be just a Virginia university now, or a community college. Another option is another in the student ID realm is by students that are in high school, for example, they can use their ID. It doesn't have to have a picture from a public school or a private school, again, in Virginia, not outside of Virginia. One area that still requires a photo is if you want to use your employer issued ID, it has to have your photo on it. One of the most liberal options is that any current utility bill, bank statement, government check, paycheck, or other government document that has your name and address on it can be used as well. If you don't have any of those, you still have one final option. And this is the option that if you want to talk about an action item is probably the one that is at most risk in the future, particularly if we get a more conservative General Assembly or a governor. And this last option is if you don't have any other ID, you can actually sign an ID confirmation statement. It's a fairly short statement. And you sign, you put your name and you sign it, and you basically affirm or confirm that you are who you are. And there is language on that form that says that you're subject to a felony prosecution if you sign that with intent to falsify your identification. So we're in a pretty good place now in Virginia. We have some risks coming from the outside if things become more conservative, but fortunately we are in a good place, and it's something that we need to try to preserve in the future. So that is all I need to say, and I welcome the next steps.
Thanks so much, Janet. Just going to share some action steps here for everyone to see. All right, hopefully that's visible to everybody. So from the top, as Chris mentioned, there are a couple of upcoming events. I'm sure there are many others too. These are the two that Chris mentioned. We put the link for the March 30th meeting in the chat because it's in only 2 days. So I might not get the resources out in time for you to attend if you'd like to do that. So there's information there. And then as many of our speakers mentioned, oops, sorry, I'm losing my, there we go. As many of our speakers mentioned, voter registration is really key. There's sort of 2 prongs here, or more than 2 probably, with voting rights. There's the voter registration to get as many eligible voters as possible registered. And then there's also working on the laws to expand the eligibility more broadly. For voter registration, as Andrea said, check your voter registration. As she mentioned, there are errors that can happen to those of us that actually are voting for whatever reason. And as she said, check 4 times a year. I made a note of that for myself because I hadn't heard that frequency. And then for voter registration events, I like to think about these as going to where people live, where they shop, where they eat, where they work, and where they play. So you can work with the League of Women Voters and some of our other organizations here to set up these voter registration events. It could be a table or some clipboards. Either individuals from those organizations can come, or you can be trained, pretty simple training to do voter registration yourself. But that is really key, just to increase the numbers and make sure that everybody who wants to vote is signed up in terms of the timing for the primaries and then the November elections. And then volunteering, always key to any kind of social justice work. There is, of course, phone banking. There's postcard writing. Reclaim Our Vote with the Center for Common Ground has really terrific postcard campaigns. There's one happening right now with Virginia voters. They have them periodically throughout the year. This is a great family activity. Kids can, draw pictures on the cards and make them more personal. And it's just a really great direct way to communicate with voters that maybe, they may not be actively registered anymore, or maybe to, find out where they can register to vote, or just where they can vote. So that's a really good way. And then we can get lots of people registered, but they can't maybe get to the polls. So there are many organizations, both nonpartisan and partisan, who arrange rides to the polls. So if you have a car, it is always welcome to be able to help seniors or the disabled or anyone who just can't easily get to the polling places if they're somewhere not convenient or close by. So I encourage you to sign up to do that. And then, as we know, many of the nonprofits doing this great work have very small staff who are stretched thin, or no staff, they're all volunteer, and they could really use admin support. So if you know how to work on a spreadsheet or enter stuff into a database or have marketing skills, they would welcome any of that, that support, kind of that infrastructure help within their organization, just to enable them to do the work that they do. And then, as Jamie mentioned, petition our local officials to pass HR 1, all of the legislation that's been discussed, not only federal, but our Virginia legislation, as Chris mentioned, the SJ 272, that sounds like it's going to be a really big push for us in next year, 2022. So, get just actively involved in the legislation that's moving through our government. And then moving over to the right, empower, I think this is a really important piece of social justice work, very much so. There's sometimes a tendency to want to swoop in and be that savior complex, which is not always a good thing in social justice work. And so I recommend, donating to all of the organizations featured on this panel, but also a lot of the grassroots organizations that are already doing the work on the ground in really effective ways. If you don't have the time or the energy to commit to actively or frequently participate, then money is always welcome, because it could be something as simple as buying those clipboards for the voter registration documents, or hiring a bus to take a whole group of people somewhere to, actively work in a community. So money can always be used. And then also making sure everybody is included in the conversation. This radical inclusion, this is really important. These are just a few of the groups, but making sure everybody is part of the effort. Also, what OJ mentioned about poll workers really struck a chord with me, making sure all of these individuals are included in the process as well, just to encourage voting, and also just to encourage inclusiveness. So just making sure that's a part of whatever work you're doing. And then, as I mentioned, there are groups that are already doing great work. A lot of the great voter turnout last November was due to local canvassers who went door to door and had personal conversations with fellow people in their communities and had that connection. And so often, they just need the rides, the food, the water to get out there and do the work. And, there may be a group of college students who are really eager to participate, and all they need is a ride to that community and some pizza for dinner just to be a part of it. So, think of kind of those types of ways in which we can support those that are already working. Relational organizing, this is sort of an idea of networking, getting one person registered, encouraging them to speak to 5 other people, sort of extending out the work that's done. And then, of course, involve youth. Make sure, they're part of this too. It's always a great conversation starter. Also, just a great way to set an example for our young folks in being part of social justice work, and also being part of democracy. So I encourage you to bring the kids along if you have kids. And then lastly, educate. There are some really great trainings available. Our own Justice and Witness Action Network has held community organizer training. There are many others available too. If you really want to get involved, not only in voting rights, but other social justice work, this is a really great way to be trained in some effective ways to make change. And then the League of Women Voters has civics education workshops available. We'll include that information in the resources. If you have a book group or some other group of homeowners association, any individuals who are interested in these issues and want to learn more. I know that I'm my civics education in high school and college was incomplete, or I have forgotten much of it. So, I think we all can use a refresher on how our government works and how we can, cause change. And then lastly, just a screening of this wonderful film that came out last fall, All In: The Fight for Democracy. It shows not only sort of historically the impact on voting rights, but also current day. And our very own O.J. Siemens is featured in the film. I found it on Amazon Prime. I think it may be available other places too. So I recommend you check out that film. And then we'll be adding some more action steps based on some of the presentations today. And I'll send that out later this week. So I'm going to stop sharing here and I'm going to hand it over to Leslie, who has been compiling some questions for the panelists.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start off with a question for Andrea. It's about a little bit more about why Virginia voters were deregistered. Somebody said that they were sending postcards, but don't remember why they got in this place to start. And then another question along that is, how much of the purging of voter rolls, or the voter maintenance of the voter rolls, is determined by the state, and how much is determined by the local registrars? Andrea?
All right, those are great questions. In Virginia, it is the state that took over and controls who gets removed from the voter rolls. So Virginia uses a system called ERIC, where basically they take the Virginia voter file and they compare it to the Postal Service change of address database. So they look at that and see, are there people here with an address and there is a change of address form that has been filed. And so if there is such a thing, they send a postcard to the voter. Now, the problem is a lot of times the voter gets a postcard, they look at it and go, yeah, everything is correct, and they throw it away. And so when there's no response to the Board of Elections, they go, gee, I guess that voter is no longer there. The other reason people get removed from the voter rolls in all states is they have an active felony conviction. Remember, we do not currently have in effect the full democracy restoration, so that even if you have a felony, as long as you're not incarcerated, you have the ability to vote. There are many people who have felony convictions who, for whatever reason, have never been imprisoned. That felony conviction says they will not be able to vote. And then the other thing that happens is with the ERIC system, they look at the Social Security request for survivor benefits. So if they think you died, then you could also be removed from the rolls. The main reason why voters who still live in Virginia get removed from the rolls is they have not voted. And again, Virginia allows you to miss 2 presidential elections. That is 8 years. So if you don't vote in any of those elections in between, the state says not voting must either A, not be here, or B, they don't want to vote, and they remove.
Okay, thank you. We're getting questions about for these. This will be for Chris. Who is helping people released from state custody register to vote? What is the most efficient way to register voters and help them get IDs as a complete confinement? And just similarly, what outreach is recommended so that we have this segment of the population that they will participate in the voting franchise? Chris?
Question. The NAACP, the League of Women Voters, Spread the Vote, and lots of other nonpartisan partisan groups do a lot of voter registration. It's been hard in the past year because we can't really have tables set up outside of places. Our group, Spread the Vote, works a lot with homeless shelters. So we try to reach those people who may have difficulty or aren't interested in voting or feel that they've lost their voting privileges because of felony convictions. And there's a lot of them. So we do, help them apply. We check online for them. And sometimes we find out that they have had their rights restored and they had no idea, even though it was maybe 10 years ago. They could have been voting all that time, but nobody told them that this had happened because probably a certificate was mailed to them from the governor's office, but they're on the streets or they've moved. They're no longer at that old address. So it's difficult. But there's lots of, reach out to any of these groups. They can all help people request their rights be restored. Sounds like it's going to be done more automatically this year, but you just never know. So, hope that
Thank you.
answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. Here's a question for Lucy. Practically speaking, how can people be helped on election day to get access, disability related access? Are extra volunteers needed to help with this?
Lots of different ways to do it. So generally speaking, if someone asks for help or an accommodation and they're told no, then what I usually say is ask for whoever is in charge of the precinct. Oftentimes poll workers, especially if it's their first day volunteering, are not familiar with ADA and are not familiar with all the accommodations. So I'm a big fan of don't take no for an answer, right? Also, if someone is stuck there, I say, you can email me or Facebook message me at that exact same moment, and I can text you right back with the law to have in your hand so that you can navigate it. You can likewise contact the Virginia Department of Elections, and sometimes right there on the phone, they can give advice or give rapid help. You can always request casting a provisional ballot if there's a weird question or something that's going on, right? So I just say, no matter what, just keep saying you want to vote, keep saying you want to vote, keep saying you want to vote, document, ask for help, ask for somebody else, keep pushing and pushing. Because obviously once polls close that day, even if a mistake was made and they should have accommodated whatever it was that you need, at that point, that election has gone by and there's not a chance anymore. So just keep pushing as much as you can at the time. And the ARC is a resource. And generally speaking, the Virginia Department of Elections is very helpful on the day of when we've had disability and access voter issues. And usually, like I said, those higher level poll workers are another good resource.
Thank you. Here's a question for Janet. Can you clarify the use of IDs for registering to vote versus voting? This person said we had a lot of questions about this on the hotline leading up to the November election. Janet?
That's a great question. And with regard to registering, if you register in person, you don't have to have any ID at all. You just fill out the form and that works. If you register by mail, you also don't have to have any registration with that registering by mail. And that pretty much applies to the same thing like if you register with a third party at a table in front of in an event. There's a little quirky thing in Virginia law that actually is going to change with the General Assembly action taken on absentee voting. So I'm not going to even go into that because at least by the time you have the June primaries and certainly by November, this quirky thing with mailed registration will no longer be applicable. And then finally, if you register by online, which is the typical place a lot of people are trying to do now, because it's so hard to do things in person with the COVID crisis, you do have to have a have had, yeah, like a driver's license or a DMV identification to utilize that online registration service. So in general, you don't have to have it, but if you want to use the online service, you do have to have a driver's license or a DMV identification card.
Thank you. One more question here, and I'll start with Jamie, and then maybe other panel members will want to join in. And this is, what legislative solutions in Virginia would have greatest impact in fostering higher voter participation? Jamie, do you have any thoughts?
The first thought would be to go back to, I think, what Julia was highlighting, the idea of automatic voter registration. If you look at our Constitution, the federal Constitution, we actually don't all have a right to vote. Even things like the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment are negative rights. They're prohibitions on discriminating against the right to vote for on the basis of race or on the basis of sex. And so the idea of proactively giving everyone a right to vote from the beginning is something that seems so fundamental to democracy, but it is not how our federal Constitution is framed. So the movement in Virginia toward that was really exciting. And then secondarily, anything we can do to keep expanding voter access. And so COVID was an important opportunity to move toward that, but expanding, moving away from the idea of voting day and having, expanded voting and extended voting hours, I think are so incredibly important. Nationally, we're at a 62, the peak voting we've had in recent elections was 62%. So everything we're talking about is keeping 62% voting, and we're not even really yet talking about how we get the other 40% engaged and enfranchised. So many important things to do to improve voter access.
Thank you, panel members. I am going to pass it back to Hannah to finish off the.
Thanks, Leslie. Yeah, I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all the questions. Of course, I know you have many. We encourage you to connect with all of our panelists through their organizations with any further questions, or any that we already have on from you. We can also go back to the panelists and get some answers to there. And we'll have contact info in the resources page I'm sending out this week. I'll close this event with a thank you to all of our panelists and those of you who have joined us, and then to Rock Springs staff who lift up social justice work under the leadership of Reverend Kathy Dwyer, and then Reverend Laura Martin, Leslie Atkinson, Diana Maxwell, who worked behind the scenes. Thank you so much. As Jens Stoltenberg said, by voting, we add our voice to the chorus that forms opinions and the basis for actions. Let's all make sure that everyone's voices can be heard. Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.